This episode is one that I was really excited about, especially because we keep hearing about the environment, climate change, and COP26 in the news. People use phrases like net zero, climate targets, emissions, negative emissions that can sometimes be overwhelming. We're also seeing an increase in extreme weather events like more wildfire, more droughts, and more floods, which is why I thought this interview might be useful. In the talk that you're about to hear, I spoke to Professor Freebairn from the University of Melbourne. Here are the topics that you can expect to hear about in the video: greenhouse gas emissions, adaptations to climate change, the pros and cons of these adaptations, and what success would look like when it comes to the environment. I hope you enjoy the video. So let's go with the first question. As an economist, how do you approach the environmental problem?
It's a very complicated set of different problems. So here we're talking about managing the water, the atmosphere, and all the plants and animals that are tied to those natural resources. And so it's a classic example of, in some areas, market forces are pretty effective. So if we think about farming, we know that letting individual farmers own their own land and make choices about what products to produce, how much fertiliser to use, when to plant, harvest, and so on, they generally make the smartest decisions. But then we run into issues of, even in farming, if they're using fertiliser and pesticides, and some of that runs off into rivers and dams, that affects third parties. And that's what we call an external cost. And there we have to have some sort of form of market intervention. If we get to really big tricky issues like national parks, where we're protecting unique flora and fauna, and to some extent, we just want to protect it for our future generations. That's an area, if we left it to the market, you would get exploitation and destruction of most of the flora and fauna. And so here is an area where government intervention to perhaps the ownership and operation of national parks is the big issue. And then we can get to the really complicated one, which is greenhouse gas emissions. So this is you and I driving a car or catching public transport, using electricity. We generally take no notice of the carbon dioxide emissions. And so they just get pumped into the atmosphere from each and every country. And this adds to the global stock of pollution. And in due course, as that global stock of greenhouse gas emissions expands or increases, we get climate change. And so the decisions of you and I on how we're going to move around or how much electricity we're going to run ultimately affects climate change for everybody right across the globe. And under our current arrangements, we tend to ignore those costs of climate change. So this is an issue of a global pollution of very long life. And so here we're struggling, how do we get global cooperation to try and reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in a cost-effective way? And of course, the Glasgow meeting is an attempt to try and come to grips with that. But as we're finding, it's a really difficult, challenging set of issues.
Yeah. What kind of challenges would there be? So there's cost. What else is there to combating climate change?
Well, I think the challenge is it's still more costly to use less polluting ways. of, say, generating electricity. So if you've got existing coal-fired power stations and even gas stations, you don't have to take account of the investment cost, because that's a sunk cost. Whereas if you're going to replace it with new solar and wind and backup batteries and pumped hydro, you've got to meet the total costs. And so replacing the current fossil fuel electricity with solar and wind, and especially backup for reliable power, then that's going to cost more money. And we've got to work out who's going to be forced to do that. And so one of the big challenges is that is getting a global agreement to do this. So essentially for the last couple of centuries, developed countries, the Europes, the US, the Australias, have been steadily polluting, burning coal and gas, and we've got pretty high sustainable living standards for most of our citizens. And so you could reasonably ask us to pay some money to reduce our pollution. On the other side of the story, we've got developing countries, the Indias, the Indonesias, the Africas, much of Latin America, who haven't been into the Industrial Revolution very much. They haven't been doing much pollution, and they've got lots of their population still in poverty. And so they're rightly saying, now listen, you guys use polluting fossil fuels for an industrial revolution to get yourself out of poverty. You're asking us to do the same thing? We want some sort of a break. And then we have places like China and Russia who are kind of in between. And they're sort of praying for a special break. And so how do we get a global agreement across these rich developed countries, the very poor developing countries, and sort of the emerging ones to come to an agreement? And what Glasgow is showing is that that's very, very difficult. And, you know, we've got pledges by some of the rich nations to reduce pollution by 2050. China says they'll do it by 2060. India says we're going to stretch it out to 2070. Now, even if every country agreed to meet those targets, it's doubtful that we would hold temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. It would be more likely approaching 2 or 3. Is that the right way to go? How do we fit all that stuff together? That's challenging economic analysis. We're trying to trade off the costs of moving more quickly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions versus the extra costs of doing that. And then how do we spread these costs around between developing and emerging economies and get a global agreement with an United Nations framework where you can just ask people to cooperate. You can't actually compel them to do these policy changes. We don't have a powerful international agreement to make this happen. So those are challenges that everybody is facing.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Another group of people who are adapting to climate change are Australian farmers that I know you wrote a paper about. So what kind of things do the Australian farmers do to find a solution to climate change?
So what they're facing is higher temperatures, and in southern Australia, lower rainfall, and perhaps in northern Australia, they'll have more rainfall. So they've got to change the genetic material they use for plants and animals so that they can better survive the higher temperatures and the changes in rainfall. The farmers have got to, many of them got to change their mix of enterprises. They've got to change their planting times, their fertiliser and pesticide usage, their harvesting methods, all that sort of stuff. So how do we get them to change those circumstances? Well, I think this is a mixture of government involvement and smart decisions by individual farmers. So if I take the individual farmers, they know more about what's going on their particular farm. They know more about how different production methods respond to climate changes and which varieties, which planting times, fertiliser rates will best work for them. So you want to, I think, leave a lot of the decisions to individual farmers. And what we know is they've been good at this in the past. So if we look over the last 100 odd years of farming in Australia, they've adapted to massive new developments in technology. They've gone from horses and carts to tractors and trucks to very sophisticated machinery. They've worked out that labour has become very expensive relative to machinery. So they've substituted machinery for labour. They've expanded their farm sizes. They've adopted new varieties, new production methods. And so with all these changes, they've increased production per farmer. They've produced food that's got cheaper and cheaper. And they've obtained sustainable living standards for themselves. And so adaptation, I think, to climate change is not going to be all that different to adaptation in new machinery, to changes in higher labour costs relative to machinery costs, better varieties and all that sort of stuff. But to facilitate that, government's got to provide some key roles. First, it's got to provide as best they can information about climate change. So this has got public good properties, just as forecasts of climate over the next month, the next season. So government has to invest a whole lot in understanding climate change and forecasting what will happen over the next month or growing season. That's a big role for government. And they're doing that sort of stuff. And in a way, it's got global involvement. Most of the research and development for the farm sector has got to be funded and organised at a larger level than the farm. It's not really up to individual farmers to develop new varieties. Because if one farmer does it, those farmers next door just copy it off that farmer, and they've spent all the money developing the new variety, and the farmers next door copy it for free. So what you've got to do is internalise this research and development. And that can be done partly, as it in Australia, by organised levies on the sale of all farm products. And that's then pooled into farmer organised research and development organisations. It's also have government involvement in providing, say, tax concessions and subsidies for research and development into how do you adapt to these new changing climatic conditions. And of course, there'll continue to be changes in availability of machinery, in changes of human needs and so on. And of course, another way of doing it is that government provides property rights for new varieties, for new equipment that helps internalise these externalities. Now, the truth of the matter, of course, is that not all farmers are going to successfully adapt. You know, I think we're looking at much bigger farms, more capital intensive, people who are quick at experimenting and adapting to new varieties, new management systems that better suit the new climate. And so there are a number of farmers who are not going to adapt. So in developed countries, and we would hope in due course in developing countries, their governments will set out a social safety net, progressive income tax systems, and income support for farmers as well as the unemployed who are unable to adapt. And so I see a mixture of individuals doing what's best for them, but being provided with information, research and development, and better understanding of climate change and its effects, and exploring some of the different decision changes. And in a sense, this is no really different than you and I adapting how we change our lifestyle and our prevention of adverse health events. Government provides the big framework and the information, but you and I make sensible use of that information. You know, when should I get vaccinated? When should I wear smart clothing? How should I change my buildings to better adapt to a changing climate? And if I live in an area that's more cyclone prone, more drought prone, more bushfire prone, I have better buildings and I have emergency systems and I can adapt to this changing world.
Okay, and I think you've already mentioned a few, but what are some mitigation instruments?
Some of the, sorry?
Mitigation instruments for climate change.
Well, we can look at instruments to reduce pollution. And the ideal model from an economist's perspective is placing a price on carbon. And so what we say is greenhouse gas emissions involve an external cost. And that external cost is the emissions add to the global stock of pollution. And that pollution is what causes climate change down the track. And that adversely affects our health, agriculture, the availability of water, protection of the environment, adverse events, destroying buildings and roads and so on. So what the idea of a carbon tax is essentially to internalise that external cost. And so it says, if you're burning fossil fuels, then you not only pay for the cost of extracting the coal and the gas and burning it to produce electricity and energy, you also contribute or recognise that it's contributing to climate change and its associated costs. And so that what that does is says to producers of pollution-intensive electricity and transport, this has got external costs as well as private costs. Why don't you have a look at some other less polluting ways, like renewable energy, like in due course, electric cars, and that will work to reduce pollution. Those higher costs also provide incentives for you and I as consumers of electricity to think about ways to reduce our consumption. So think about smarter ways of using our air conditioning systems. And so think about, you know, maybe turn the temperature down a little bit in summer and put up with a little bit of colder temperature in winter. Think about buying new refrigerators and cooking material, stoves and so on, that are much more energy efficient. So what the carbon tax does is internalise the external cost and provides incentives for producers and households to reduce the production and consumption of pollution-intensive products. We also know that we've got to change our production systems and our consumption systems. So this involves new technology. So this is finding cheaper ways for renewables, cheaper ways to store electricity for renewables. If we think about cars, it's shifting from fossil fuel, petrol and diesel vehicles to ultimately electric vehicles. So that's cheaper batteries, cheaper ways of charging vehicles and so on. It has you and I thinking about smarter ways to run our air conditioning systems. So that, for example, if we went to university and we were studying and we thought, oh, well, I'll be home by about 6 o'clock tonight to cook dinner, I'll set my air conditioner to come on about 5:30. And then it turns out you meet some of your mates and decide, oh no, let's go out for dinner and talk about how we're going to solve the world's problems. Well, then I can just go to my iPhone and say to the air conditioner, hey, don't bother coming on at 5:30. I'm not coming home. Just stay as you are. And what you can do is you can do that saving in electricity for your air conditioner and buy a slightly better bottle of wine or a nicer meal. And then when you get home, wow, you don't have to worry about the air. You're nicely sozzled with alcohol and a great meal. You go off to sleep, you don't need the air conditioner. That's the sort of research that we can do. I think it's also true that my waxing on lyrical about how good a carbon tax is that it assumes that we're all very rational, smart people. What we know from behavioural economics is that many of us tend to focus on the current period rather than the future. And the most interesting one of this is the purchase of motor vehicles. What we know with current technology is that if you buy an electric vehicle, it's going to cost you more money up front, maybe some tens of thousands of dollars up front, a more expensive vehicle. But over the life of that vehicle, fueling your vehicle with electricity actually turns out to be much cheaper than fueling a petrol-driven car with a petrol. But it turns out most of us focus on that upfront cost rather than the running cost. So it may be that to recognise this behavioural economics short-termism, we should support a carbon price with regulations, maybe going all the way saying all vehicles beyond such and such a date should be electricity, or by also regulations to have the fuel efficiency of petrol-driven vehicles improved over time. So I think a mix of a carbon price, of regulations, and of providing funds and organisational structures for research and development to find new ways that are less polluting and lower cost is a threesome package I would recommend governments explore.
I think one thing I would like to ask you is that you talked a lot about the different roles in climate change. So there's a lot of government intervention necessary, our individual choices that are important. There are also a lot of activists and strikes. But what are the more efficient ways of combating climate change, and what actually doesn't work?
I think the truth of the matter is there are literally millions and millions of ways of reducing our carbon footprint. So it's not just on the production side. You know, we tend to focus on burning coal to make electricity or using oil to make petrol to support motor vehicles. Yes, we can reduce pollution by going from coal and gas to renewables in electricity. Yes, once we get into the electricity world, we can go from petrol-driven vehicles to electric-driven vehicles. But also, you and I, in our own decisions, you know, our choice of our air conditioning. We could reduce pollution greatly by, say, in summer, rather than having my air conditioner running at, say, 19 or 18 degrees centigrade, I could say, oh, well, I can put up with 20 or 22. And in winter, instead of having it set at 25 degrees centigrade, I can bring it down to 21 to 22. That would save quite a lot. And that might be much, much cheaper than a quick rush to replace a coal-fired power station with new wind and solar. Again, you and I can think seriously about our transport. Do I really need to drive the car to the university or to the shopping market every day of the week? Or could I catch public transport or ride a bike or walk? These are probably among the lower cost ways of reducing pollution. And so what a carbon tax does is just says, listen, pollution intensive ways now are relatively more expensive. You think about the cheapest ways as a producer and as a consumer to reduce your pollution. And you and I are better judged at making that decisions than somebody in a government department. So that's why we favour putting a price on pollution rather than regulations.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of story I would have in mind.
Okay. And then my final question would be, for the Glasgow conference and just in general, what would be success for climate change? Would it be carbon neutral by 2050 or by a certain date? Would it be everyone pledging to, you know, try harder? What exactly would be success for you?
I'm not a great fan of the 2050 targets. What I think is really important is thinking seriously about what are the ways to encourage and achieve reductions. And so that leads me to push much more strongly for moving to a carbon price across the globe. And I'm willing to think about concessions for developing countries. I think it's also an issue about thinking about regulations, so on vehicles, on appliances. Again, it's an issue of how do we globally put our minds together to develop the new technologies. And in particular, one would hope that the developed countries are willing to take the bulk of that expenditure and then make that new technology available to developing countries so that they can quickly phase in, say, renewable energy and electric vehicles. And then, of course, we've got really tricky issues. What do we do about the production of, say, steel and cement? Current technology tells us they're probably still going to be very carbon intensive methods. We may be able to find ways of getting around that. But my guess is if we're going to have steel and cement in 2050, there's going to be a lot of pollution in those production processes. So then the question is, how do we offset that? There's sort of a dream that we're going to have carbon offsets. That is, we're going to plant more trees, or maybe we're going to find algae or whatever to absorb carbon at a faster rate than we do now. So there's a lot of those things to do. Agriculture is really tricky. You know, about a third of global pollution is still with agriculture. And we know that we're going to have a bigger population in 2050 than we do now. And a lot of our global population is still not living with food security. So we're going to have to increase food production over the next 20 or 30 years. Now, possibly, if we all become vegetarians, then that takes sheep and cattle out, and one of the sources of pollution. But I don't think that's going to happen. And again, that's only part of the story. So I think we are still going to end up with important parts of the economy that are going to continue to pollute. And so I don't think we're going to get to zero. That then says, can we offset with offsets? Is that by reforestation, or is it by actually carbon capture and storage? There's still a whole lot of technologies that are in scientists' dream books that will need to be developed if we are to get to anywhere near zero by 2050. And let's face it, the Chinas and Indias are the big polluters. They still have enormous numbers of people in poverty, and we somehow need to bring them into the net to be able to adopt technology to get their bulk of their populations out of poverty in a way that reduces pollution. And I think we've got a lot of hard work as a globe to make that happen. But it's an exciting challenge, and it would be a better world if we could succeed.
Yeah, it's a nice way to think of it as a challenge rather than a problem. Well, it was so nice to meet you and talk to you. Thank you so much for agreeing. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, and my pleasure, and all the best.
We learned about the different adaptations to climate change and what success would look like when it comes to the environment. I really like Professor Freebairn's way of looking at the crisis. He looks at it not as one solution, but as a collection of many different solutions where every single person can make an impact. I want to hear your thoughts on this. If you have any more information or thoughts about the topic, please leave it in the comments. I would also love to hear your suggestions about topics you would like me to cover.